So, good afternoon. Well, the Complex Systems Group welcomes you to this Thursday noon lecture with Dr. Scott Ortman. He is currently the Omidyar Fellow at the Santa Fe Institute and Lightfoot Fellow at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. He received his doctorate in anthropology in 2010 from Arizona State University, with his dissertation winning the 2011 Outstanding Dissertation Award from the Society for American Archaeology. His special interest areas include engagement-based modeling of social and natural systems and coupled human-natural systems in the American Southwest. Today, he'll be speaking about how conceptual systems, or culture, have grown in complexity over time and have played an important role in developing social coordination. Please join me in welcoming Scott Ortman.
Thanks, John. Thanks for being here. We have an hour, so I'm going to jump right into it. There's a few questions that are going to guide my talk here today. The first one is, what role has culture played in the evolution of social complexity? Societies that we live in today are much larger, much more complicated than those of the past. There are many views about this. Many of them focus on environment or resources, technology, other factors like that. My question is, well, has culture played a role as well? The second guiding question is, well, how would you tell? Dealing with the evolution of complexity in human societies is dealing largely with the past and sometimes the distant past. And the question is how to recover good evidence of ancient cultures from the kinds of evidence that archaeologists have to work with. The third question is, well, that's fine. What is culture anyway? There's a lot of views about what culture consists of, many different definitions of it. Today I'll be giving you my own sense of where I've arrived at in thinking about culture from my own work. And my talk is going to have four parts. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on the nature of social complexity in humans and how it has come to be. Secondly, I want to give you my sense of the way I view culture as a system of shared mental models that are spread throughout populations and that govern the way they interact with each other. Finally, third, I'm going to look at the role of one particular aspect of culture that I call conceptual metaphors and what I would consider to be major transitions in the history of a few specific societies. And finally, I'll put all these things together to give you a hypothesis I'm working on about how culture was involved in this process. So, the human societies have undergone an incredible transformation over the past 12,000 years, and this is the way I like to begin in thinking about the problem. 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, all humans lived in hunter-gatherer bands, 25 people at most of the days, and sometimes seasonal groupings of up to a few hundred people. Most of the people in these bands were relatives. Not only did you know each person personally, but you were actually related to everyone in your group. Food sharing and sharing of other goods was the norm. Our anthropologists call this generalized reciprocity. You gave things to people in your group without regard for getting necessarily equal value things in return. You just shared and shared alike. Most economic production was strongly kin-based. The division of labor was largely based along gender lines, and also sometimes different relatives, people with different social relations within the group, were involved in doing different tasks for the group. And finally, decision-making was based on consensus. Groups got together and they came to agreement on what they should do when faced with important issues. Today, most of us live, by contrast, in nation-states where we never even meet most of the citizens of our nation. Most of our citizens are strangers to us. We've never met them, we're not related to them, we know nothing about them except that they're citizens. Most exchange is economically based, where we exchange things of like value, money for goods usually. Production is highly specialized. For example, the labor of hundreds of thousands of different people is incorporated into this single room that we're standing in right now. And we couldn't be here doing this talk if there weren't thousands of people out there that knew how to make all of the different components of this room, and then the transportation structures to bring them all together and to create the space that we're in. Finally, decision-making about important political issues occurs through bureaucracies, hierarchical decision-making structures where not everyone has an equal say in what people are going to do, and there are often people that don't like what we're going to do. So it really is a remarkable transformation that has taken place. This is one way of looking at this transformation in archaeological time. Each dot in this plot here corresponds to an archaeological tradition from somewhere around the world. And I plotted them according to how long ago the tradition existed in the past on the x-axis, and on the y-axis I've plotted them according to the population size of the largest settlement within that archaeological tradition. This is one of the proxies that archaeologists use for thinking about the level of social complexity in society. So 12,000 years ago, you can see here, this is in thousands, so 10th of 1,000, 100 people, was about the largest size settlement that archaeologists have found anywhere in the world of cultures dating that long ago. As time's gone on, you can see that some cultures have become much larger in scale, but many have also remained at this relatively small level, relatively modest level. So one way to describe this is that there has been an expanding envelope of complexity over the past 10,000 years in human societies. Some societies have gotten much, much larger, and others have stayed relatively small. Now, some of the models that archaeologists have proposed in the past to describe why this envelope has expanded have to do with things like, well, people that lived in more productive environments perhaps were able to produce more complex societies, larger scale societies, or perhaps major technological innovations that occurred at some point enabled humans to realize this potential. This point of view suggests that people will become complex whenever they can. And the data, in fact, do not support those views. This is a map showing, again, each symbol is an archaeological tradition. The x-axis is the intrinsic productivity of the land on which each of these traditions occurs. It's actually the most productive patch of land associated with each archaeological tradition. And then here's our complexity score, the largest settlement. And I've color-coded traditions from various parts of the world that are the traditional hearths of early civilizations. So you can see up here, I have central Mexico, Mesopotamia, the highland Andes, and Egypt. And if you look at these data here, what you can see is that there is no pattern between the emergence of complexity and the intrinsic productivity of the environments in which these different societies took root. And on the right, if you look at these symbols, you can see that there actually is a nice trend toward increasing complexity through time if you plot these traditions according to how long they've been farmers. So what it shows is, well, yeah, the longer people have been farmers, the more complex they got in areas of the world where early civilizations emerged. But if you look at all of the points, including areas outside of these traditional areas, what you see, once again, is that there's no pattern. So the technological innovation here is one of the things involved in the accumulation of complexity in the traditional hearths of civilization, but it's not sufficient to account for what happened. So how can we think about this process if environment and technology by themselves are not enough to account for it? One of the directions that is very interesting that's emerging from research going on at SFI right now is that it appears that economies and returns to scale are a very important part of human organization. And what you see here are two plots that look at the populations of modern contemporary U.S. cities on the X, and on the left here I have the total miles of roadway in each of these cities. And on the right I have the gross domestic product of the inhabitants created by these cities. And the black lines reflect a proportionate relationship between these two variables. So what it means is if the dots lined up with the black lines, what it would show you is that people add roads proportionally to population as cities grow. Or over here it would show you that the GDP of a city grows proportionally to the number of people participating in it. And what you can see is that in both cases that is not what occurs. In the case of road miles, what you can see is that people add fewer miles of road per capita as cities get larger, whereas the gross domestic product of a city grows faster than the population of the city. So this is called an economy of scale, and this is called a return to scale. And what it suggests is that there are intrinsic benefits to humans organizing themselves at larger and larger scales. And it turns out that these kinds of patterns show up even in the archaeological record. This is an example of one study I'm working on. It uses settlements from pre-Hispanic central Mexico. On the left, you can see the blue dots are settlements dating to the Aztec period, before the Spanish arrived in central Mexico, plotted according to the population of the site and the settled area. And the red symbols refer to settlements in the same area in 1960 based on census data. And you can see here the dotted line is the proportionate scaling. The fact that the fit line is, the power law fit to these data has a more shallow slope than the proportionate line, shows you that as in modern cities, as settlements get bigger, they can get denser. People can use resources, they can use infrastructure more intensively as a settlement grows larger. A return to scale is shown here. The dotted line is proportionate scaling of the volume of public architecture constructed by a group of people of that size. And here, once again, you can see that across several different archaeological periods, sites from Tenochtitlan and Teotihuacan, the major cities of central Mexico, all the way down to the smallest early villages. What you can see is that as groups of people get together and coordinate their activities, they can produce more per person in a larger group. So I think that these economies and returns to scale are intrinsic and they're always there. They're an aspect of the world that humans can take advantage of. But of course, as I showed you in that envelope of complexity slide, not everyone has done that. Why not? The fact that these economies exist does not explain why some have taken advantage of them and others have not. Here's another way of thinking about it. Here's the largest site population of different archaeological traditions and the settled area of the largest site. And once again, you see the same economy of scale going on here. The dashed line is proportionate scaling, and the solid line is the fit line. In general, the rule we find is that as the population of a settlement doubles, its efficiency in its use of infrastructure increases only 85%. So it's about a 15% gain in efficiency with each doubling. And in contrast, for things like socioeconomic production, what we find is that as the population of a city doubles, its output increases 115%. So it gets about a 50% gain. Now, we can talk more about where that comes from because there's some interesting models that are emerging right now to explain this. But here's some other interesting data related to this question. What this shows is the health of the average person in archaeological traditions at these varying levels of complexity as measured by the size of the largest settlement. And the data are fuzzy, they're not great, but the trend at least is not toward improving health with the scale and organization of society. If anything, these data suggest that as human societies have grown more complex, they have not necessarily been good for each individual in those societies. And I think this is part of the answer to why complexity is such an interesting problem. The advantages of scale are good for groups, but they're not necessarily good for each individual in the group. And so this is the fundamental quandary that I think human societies have to figure out how to solve if they want to take advantage of these economies. So putting these things together, here's the way I think about social complexity and where it comes from. These economies and returns to scale are intrinsic, and they emerge from the coordinated behavior of people and groups through social interaction and organization. And in the history of humanity, there have been several cases where the level of complexity of a society has jumped fairly rapidly in a short period of time. They involve changes in the scale of coordination in the group. In other words, there are more people coordinating their behavior simultaneously than there were before. Now, these social networks are created from humans, and human nature, I would argue, is a mixture of what I would call selfish and groupish instincts. Sometimes humans think about what's best for me, Other times humans think about what's best for the group. And there's different situations where different aspects of our intrinsic thought processes come to the fore. And these are some of the moral instincts, I would say, that psychologists have identified in thinking about our groupish nature. Their concerns over care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity, for example. But cooperation and coordination is not necessarily better for each individual. So it seems to me that culture must play a role in promoting the groupish aspects of our nature, or what Steven Pinker recently called the better angels of our nature, in the service of larger scale coordination, despite the fact that they can be costly to many of the individuals that participate in them. But how exactly does this occur? How exactly does culture promote groupish instincts? Well, this gets back to the question of what is culture, what does it consist of, what's a good way of thinking about it? I would suggest that this is a good way of thinking about it. This is an example of something that academics do all the time. They create intellectual arguments, and when we do, we use the imagery and language of creating concrete structures in thinking about and talking about it. I'm trying to build an argument for you now. I'm using a particular metaphor that each of us share, that mental structures are like physical structures. And this is actually a large field of study in linguistics and cognitive science, where a large number of researchers are exploring the human capacity to use analogy and metaphor to conceptualize and reason about relatively abstract phenomena. And the way cognitive scientists talk about conceptual metaphor is that it's the use of the image schematic structure of a concrete source domain to conceptualize and reason about an abstract target domain. These metaphors are widely shared and often used unconsciously. They structure our language, they structure our thought processes, and they structure action as well. You can actually infer conceptual metaphors of past societies from studies of the archaeological record. And I'll give you a brief example of how I've done that in a moment. And these metaphors also become embedded in language as something that I call semantic fossils. These are traces of the metaphors of past speakers that are embedded in the histories of words in different languages. Now, this view of metaphor is not just philosophy, it's actually experimental psychology. This is just a list of some of the studies that have been done to illustrate the influence of metaphor structuring and reasoning in a variety of social dilemmas and social situations that people face. I don't want to dwell on these, but I just want you to see that there's actually experimental research behind this point of view about culture that I think is very powerful. What I've done is I've looked through this literature and developed what I call empirical generalizations about how humans express their metaphors in everyday conversation. And I've used these to develop a method for deciphering metaphors of the past as revealed through the archaeological record. So this is a list of these generalizations about how humans express their metaphors in everyday speech. What I've done is I've applied this approach to studies of the material culture of the American Southwest, and in particular the ancient Pueblo society of the Mesa Verde area in southwest Colorado near Mesa Verde National Park. And just to give one example, archaeologists have noticed that there are these interesting parallels between the woven objects found in the cliff dwellings, the famous cliff dwellings of this area, and the painted pottery that are also found in those sites. So what I've done is propose that this correspondence reflects a metaphor of ancient Mesa Verde society that in this world, in the minds of the potters, pots were textiles. And that accordingly it was important for potters to decorate them as such. From this hypothesis, what I've been able to do is show that there are patterns in the data that reflect all 6 of these empirical generalizations about how humans express their metaphors in everyday speech. But in this case, it's patterns in the expression of the metaphor in the archaeological record as based on studies of the artifacts. So using this method, I think it's possible to actually decipher or to perhaps read the minds of people of the past. I've applied this same approach to reconstruct the evolution of what I would call the container-based conceptual system of Mesa Verde culture. And what I have here is a series of particular metaphoric mappings between different realms of material culture. The oldest one is basketry onto pottery, but I've also found evidence of pottery being mapped and basketry being mapped onto the ceremonial structures that are known as kivas. Examples of weaving being mapped onto pottery via basketry. And then in more recent times I found evidence of buildings being used as a microcosm of the landscape. And then finally, containers, pots and baskets, and buildings being combined together as images of the landscape. And what I've done here is just plotted when these different kinds of expressions appeared in the archaeological record. And as you can see, there's a nice progression here from relationships between actual objects toward ever more abstract phenomenon, such that, by the time you get down to here, you've got people playing with container imagery and applying it to a whole manner of aspects of their experience that are not self-evident necessarily, but it appears to be the way Mesa Verde people thought about these things. One of the other approaches I've used in this framework is to look for the traces of metaphors embedded in the languages of likely descendants of Mesa Verde people. And this, I talked about this some in my talk last night. This is just one example. The last villages created by Mesa Verde people were these roundish-shaped structures surrounding a spring with a water source in the center, with houses that faced inward in this kind of concave, roundish environment. It looks to be another expression of this container-based imagery. And it turns out that in the language of the most likely descendants of Mesa Verde people, one of the words that is used to refer to a village is also the word for a large, low, roundish place or plaza, and it derives from an older word for a pottery vessel. So it implies that at some point in the past, people that spoke this language took a word that meant pottery vessel and mapped it onto bowl-shaped geographic environments of villages and plazas. So an example of how you can connect archaeology and language through these semantic traces. All right, so armed with these methods, what I want to do now is walk you through an example of a major transition in the complexity of a society that relates to my previous work. It deals with the migration of Mesa Verde people, at least a portion of Mesa Verde society, down to the northern Rio Grande, to the area where the Tewa-speaking pueblos are today. And I'm going to be showing you some data from a database of archaeological sites from this rectangle up here that refers to what we call the Village Ecodynamics Project study area, and this rectangle here that I refer to as the Tewa Basin. Now, during the 13th century, tens of thousands of people moved from the Mesa Verde area to the Tewa Basin. These are population curves of the VEP area and the Tewa Basin to illustrate the complementarity of the population histories of these two study areas. You can see that as a result of migration, there are about the same number of people living in that southern rectangle after 1300 as were living in the northern rectangle at 1200. So about the same number of people occupied those two areas. The environments of these two areas are actually quite similar. These are representations of the intrinsic productivity of the two environments that these Pueblo ancestors lived in. The blue bars correspond to experimental gardening yields in the area of Cortez, Colorado, which is near Mesa Verde National Park. And the green bars reflect yields in the Los Alamos area in New Mexico, which is within the Tewa Basin. And it's probably the most productive portion of the Tewa Basin. And the spread here is due to the fact that these are yields from many different places over many different years. You can see 1931 to 60 for Cortez and 1909 to 1923 for Los Alamos. In general, the yields of beans and corn in these two areas are fairly similar. So there's no basis for saying that the environment into which Pueblo people moved was a whole lot better than the one they left behind. But yet, look at what they did with the society they created after moving. The blue line reflects the proportion of the population that lived in settlements of 500 or more people, starting way back in the Mesa Verde homeland at 700 AD, going all the way through the end of the collapse of that society. And then the red line showing what happened in the Tewa Basin following the period of migration. So what you can see is this really dramatic trend and consistent trend toward the agglomeration of population into larger settlements. In fact, by 1500 AD, almost everyone in the Table Basin lived in settlements of more than 500 people, and many lived in settlements of more than 2,500 people. A really dramatic change in the scale of agglomeration of society. The dashed line here represents the proportion of population of the Mesa Verde area that lived in sites of 50 people or more. And you can see even here, Mesa Verde people had a hard time keeping relatively modest villages together over long periods of time, whereas after this period of migration, Tewa people did it just fine. The settlements that these folks created also became much more stable. Notice that this is a logarithmic scale here, and what I plotted is the number of new sites constructed per person per year in these two societies. So in the Mesa Verde area, you see a gradual improvement in this trend, a more stable settlement pattern. After migration to the Rio Grande, you see several orders of magnitude of improvement in the stability of the settlement pattern. People figured out how to stay put much better after moving to the Rio Grande. And to the extent that human social networks depend upon stability and being able to predict where your neighbors are going to be and who's going to be there and how to get along with them, this is an important change. This is a measure of the incidence of interpersonal violence in the two areas. The blue line shows prior to the, in Mesa Verde society, some periods were quite violent, where many people were killed through warfare or other forms of interpersonal violence. Following this period of migration, when many thousands of people from the Mesa Verde area moved to the Table Basin, you see this pretty dramatic decline in levels of interpersonal violence that stayed that way until the Spanish appeared in the early 1600s. So the society created by Mesa Verde migrants to the Table Basin was more peaceful than it had ever been. Finally, this is a very interesting aspect of the very interesting comparison of the two societies. The blue symbols reflect the population versus settled area of villages from the Mesa Verde area. And if you look at the slope of this line, the exponent of the fitted power law is about 0.86. That's our magic number that keeps showing up time and time again. It suggests that these settlements were created primarily to facilitate interaction among the residents of the community. It was set up primarily to facilitate the mixing of the people that lived in these villages. The red dots reflect the population versus the plaza areas, the open spaces in the centers of the villages of Table Basin sites. And the exponent of this relationship is 1.15. Once again, our magic number. That seems to, which suggests that these villages were situated so as to encourage people from other communities to come and interact with them. In other words, larger settlements have more plaza space per capita. It appears that as these communities grew, they opened themselves up, encouraging people from other communities to come and interact with them, to exchange goods and services, etc. And that this is one very important change in the way society was organized that appears to have promoted unprecedented, what I would say, call economic growth in these societies. The blue line is the ratio of decorated pottery to cooking pottery in Mesa Verde area sites dating from 700 all the way to the collapse of that society. And the red line reflects that same ratio for the Table Basin. And what you can see here is that when migration occurred and this society just got going, it wasn't so great to begin with, but as time went on, this ratio climbed to unprecedented levels. Now, what it implies is that the average household had a larger collection of decorated pots that they maintained in their house. And to the extent that decorated pottery reflects an investment of energy and resources in durable goods that they maintained, I would say the average household was wealthier in the Table Basin than it had ever been before. And the plot on the right is one way of showing that this pattern is not due to changes in the rate at which cooking pottery or utility ware pottery was deposited at these sites. It really is a change in the rate at which decorated pottery is being made, used, and discarded. So, by many different measures, the Tewa society created as a result of migration was orders of magnitude more productive, more stable, and a much larger scale of organization than had come before. I would suggest this was a major transition in the complexity of this society. There were changes in the metaphors of Tewa culture associated with this movement as well. I mentioned earlier that in the Mesa Verde homeland, ancestors of Tewa people thought about their communities using imagery of actual containers. This is one representation of that. Villages are like communal serving vessels that relatives sit around and share food out of. That's one way of thinking about it. Contemporary Tewa people, though, talk about their communities quite differently. And this is an example of a song lyric in translation from a dance held at Okewinge Pueblo, which is a Tewa-speaking village in New Mexico. In San Juan Pueblo, or Okewinge, right here in the middle of the plaza, outside the kiva, a white corn goddess stands. With her living plants, she stands prepared at dawn. So this song is referring to the female dancers in the plaza as corn goddesses, standing prepared. Here's another phrase. At Soul Village over there where the rivers join at Confluence Lake, they come right here carrying flowers. The Ohua, or cloud beings, have flowers there. They come to see our fields. This is describing the male dancers, who are representing the cloud beings, coming into the plaza to water the corn maidens. So there's obviously imagery of conjugal union going on here, but used as an image of the state of nature that they hope will occur, which is for the rains to come and give them a good harvest. Well, Tewa people today call their villages Owinge, which incorporates the verb winu, to stand upright, or to stand prepared, as we saw in that previous lyric and translation. So a translation of Owinge would be something like "they're growing upright," is the way Tewa people describe their communities today. And these are the metaphors involved. And their village is viewed as a garden, where the women are the corn and the men are the clouds. Here's one more example. Ready? We stand in San Juan town, our corn maidens and corn youths, corn mothers and corn fathers. Now we bring you misty water and throw different ways. Then likewise, throw your misty water toward San Juan. Well, many that you are, pour water over our corn maidens' ears. So in the ceremonies, there's actually men and women dancing in the plaza, singing these songs, representing the corn and the rain, and encouraging that to occur in the world. Now, I think this conception of the community as a garden dates all the way back to the period of migration from the Mesa Verde area. One way of looking at this is place names for Tewa archaeological sites. The map here shows all of the major ancestral Tewa sites in the Tewa Basin, and I want to draw your attention to these symbols with the white shading that represent sites with Tewa names that are listed right here, and they're all called Owinkeyi, which means village ruin. Keyi is ruin. So Owinge is a contemporary village. Owinkeyi is an ancestral village. These sites were abandoned as early as the early decades of the 1300s. Just after this period of migration and transformation, they were apparently already calling their villages Owinge, all the way back then. And I think that there's some other archaeological evidence of this fact. For example, when early archaeologists started surveying in the Tewa Basin, they found sites like this that have these arrangements of cobblestones creating these grid cell patterns. They were originally interpreted as foundations of Pueblo dwellings because the sizes of those cells are about the same sizes as the rooms of actual Pueblos. But it turns out that this is not a Pueblo, this is actually a field. And it is constructed so as to help the corn grow. And one of the ways it was done is to, you can see that it blends the imagery of actual structures with the actual technology of farming. So villages and gardens, the imagery of architecture and agriculture being blended together in the archaeological record. This is one other example. These are actual house foundations from an ancestral Tewa site, and in the corners of these foundations you often find an upright stone there that Tewa people refer to as a corn-growing stone or a child-growing stone. They use both terms for them. And you find these stones in the corners of these gardens with the gridded garden plots. You find these little upright stones in the corners, and you find them in the corners of house foundations. So examples of where Tewa people blend together the imagery of farming and of buildings, of people and of corn. So this appears to be the conceptual system of ancestral Tewa society from the time of migration to the Rio Grande to the present. It's the image of the community as a garden rather than the older view of the community as some sort of pottery vessel that's reflected in the actual etymologies of words in the Tewa language that reflect the older way of thinking that you can see in the Mesa Verde homeland. So it appears that during this period of time, there was a change in the manner or the style in which Tewa people imagined their communities and how they functioned. A change from wu, a vessel-type structure, a pottery-type structure, to oinge, to a garden-type structure. Well, let's think a little bit more about how this transformation might have contributed to the dramatic changes in society that I've been showing you. One way to think about this is that the experience of farming for the average person was like this. A person had to plant corn in many different spots around their environment to ensure that they could get a reasonable crop. And this is one map showing all of these gridded gardens running up and down the drainage from a particular village. Most of these gardens are quite small. They're not large enough to produce enough food to feed a family for a year. So the average farmer had to plant many such plots and had to have many such plots all over the landscape to be sure to get enough food for his or her family. These villages that were created in the Tewa Basin that I've highlighted here, you can see them in this Google Earth image. These are adobe room blocks. That's a couple football fields long. There's probably room enough for about 5,000 people in these three sites here. I've told you about the evidence of these plazas scaling up to encourage people from different villages to come and visit. In other words, in the same way that a farmer had to plant many, many plots to produce enough food to feed his family, these communities had to move frequently between different settlements and interact with each other in order to produce everything that they needed to live. I think this is the nature of the parallel imagery that was going on. So, to try and summarize this way of thinking, my suggestion is that people are corn, villages are gardens in Tewa culture, and what this shift did was change the society from one that was kin-based to one that was place-based. So the older view of the community as a whole implies the image of a family sitting around a common vessel eating food together. The new image of the garden implies an undifferentiated group in a particular place that is being nourished by the environment. What this imagery seems to have done is take positive emotions associated with rain and conjugal union and mapping them onto social relations to promote trust among people who were not as closely related to each other. So adding farming experience plus people are corn together seems to be one of the factors that promoted this new scale of regional economic integration that led to an unprecedented standard of living for Tewa people. Now, I want to very briefly run through one other example of a similar transformation from another part of the world where I think metaphor was also involved. And it has to do with the emergence of the world's first city in Mesopotamia, in the site of Uruk or Warka, down here. It occurred in the 4th millennium BC. Here's a plot of the distribution of settlement sizes from the early and middle Uruk period, and then the late Uruk period. You can see that this site is the site of Uruk that grew quite dramatically during this transition. Here's the world's oldest city. It's the city of Uruk, complete with temples and all the sorts of things you would associate with an early civilization. At Uruk, during this period of time, you find things like the Uruk vase that illustrates stratified labor for the first time in the history of humanity, social stratification under a ruler and a ruling couple. And at the time that Uruk was taking off, you could see significant shifts in the imagery of leadership in the society. In the pre-Uruk period, you get images like this of a kind of a mixed human-animal figure who is in control of the forces of nature, and especially of wild animals. Whereas in the early Uruk period, what you start to see are images of this ruler, or the N, feeding domestic animals with flowers, or taking care of the domestic flocks. And you can see some of this way of thinking is expressed even in the earliest writing from this area. I've highlighted symbols that refer to juveniles of, on one case, herded animals, and in the other case of dependent laborers. It turns out that if you study proto-cuneiform writing, what you find is that the scribes and administrators of Uruk used the techniques devised to manage domesticated flocks as a method for managing commoner labor in producing temples and collecting taxes, etc., etc. Here are some shepherding metaphors that are actually in later cuneiform texts from the early dynastic period that I think date back to the period of the Uruk expansion. The leading herdsman of all who have breath, or the king. Enlil the bright-eyed, the shepherd who decrees the fates. The shepherd person again. Inanna, you've taken charge of the crook, staff, and wand of shepherdship, which is rulership of Uruk. My God, you are my father who begot me. Lift up my face like an innocent cow in pity. How long will you neglect me, leave me unprotected like an ox? Leave me without guidance. So this is what appears to have happened in the ancient Mesopotamia when the world's first city came to be. The image of rulership was the image of shepherding. So, many of you know the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd. I think it dates back to Uruk and was invented by people in Mesopotamia in trying to figure out how to organize a class-stratified society that could produce a settlement as large as a city. So care of the domestic herds by individual shepherds was taken as a model for the relationship between the elites and the commoners in the society. The domestic animal's role was to, of course, obey the masters and do what they say. The master's role was to provide and protect the flock. And I've talked to people that hang out with shepherds in the Middle East, and what they say, you can always tell a bad shepherd from a good one, because a bad shepherd, the flock scatters everywhere, and they're totally out of control, and they can't get anything done. A good shepherd, the flock knows just what to do, they're very secure, they move as a unit, they're very productive. So the resulting organization seems to have enabled a new scale of economic production and political integration. So let's try to wrap this up and put together these ideas about culture and complexity into a more general model. I'm playing around with a couple of ideas to try and say, okay, that's fine. You see these metaphoric transformations. You can propose ways that they influenced people's thought processes in the service of social coordination. How does it actually work biologically? What I've been doing is working with a model of human decision-making developed by a guy named Antonio Damasio. He's a neuroscientist, and this is the reference here. And the way he talks about it is that humans have something we call primary emotions. These are automated responses to things that happen to them. I mean, if you touch a hot stove, you automatically recoil from it, you automatically go, ow, and your heart rate picks up. Right? When you get angry at someone, for example, your body temperature goes up, your blood vessels dilate, etc. These are automated responses that just happen. We have no control over them. They are evolutionarily ancient. They've been part of the human lineage since long before there were humans. Humans also do have something called secondary emotions, and this is images of the body states associated with primary emotions. So, for example, if you go hiking one day, and you're in the desert, and you don't take water with you, you'll get thirsty and hot. And the memories of your thirst and body state and the anxiety and other things that go with it become stored with your memory of that experience. The views, where you went, the time of year, what the weather was like, etc. These are the secondary emotions. They're images of the body state responses to our experiences. So these secondary emotions are an element of our overall bodily experience. And the key point here is that when humans reason, what we do is we evaluate different alternatives, like if we're faced with a situation, which way should we go, this way or that way, when we're hiking off in the desert? Well, what you do is evaluate the alternatives based on the secondary emotions associated with your experience. In other words, you will tend to choose courses of actions that map onto more positive body state outcomes in your past experience. You'll tend to take the path, so for example, if you have hiked in the past and you said, boy, I was really thirsty, I don't want to do that again, you might take the path that keeps you closer to the water next time. I think that the somatic marking hypothesis is important for thinking about the role of metaphor in complexity. So our experiences, including our secondary emotions, become the source domains of metaphors. In many societies, for example, anger is conceptualized metaphorically as heat in a container. Well, your actual bodily experience of getting angry is of pressure building up, your blood pressure going up, of your temperature rising, of you start to sweat sometimes, the blood vessels dilate, etc., etc. Well, that body state imagery has become incorporated into metaphors for anger, where in every language that's ever been studied, the language used to describe anger involves the language of heat and pressure and other things like that, our body state responses. Metaphors encourage the transfer of all the source domain imagery to the target domain. So one example from contemporary discourse is the discourse of tax relief. Right? So what I did here is, well, if you hear that, we need tax relief. Well, who doesn't want tax relief? I mean, it's a good thing, right? If taxation is a burden and it's a load we have to carry that keeps us from being productive, who doesn't want to have a lighter load? And that imagery conveys the body state correlates of carrying a heavy load to propose how you should view the particular issue being discussed. So as a result, metaphors encourage behavior that are consistent with the emotional correlates of the imagery that's being invoked in a given conversation or situation. So what I would suggest is that coordinated human behavior emerges from individuals behaving in terms of the emotional correlates of their shared social metaphors. So let's take this. I know we have a few minutes left, so let's think about how this could lead into an argument or a theory about how social complexity relates to metaphors. Once again, economies and returns to scale are inherent in the world, but realizing them requires coordinated behavior. Social coordination is not necessarily good for each individual. In ancient Uruk, for example, most of the commoners did not necessarily have a better life as a result of the city of Uruk being formed. The health of the average person in many ancient societies did not improve as the society grew in scale and complexity. But yet, it is good for the group. The group was more productive overall, even though many of the individuals in it were not better off. Let's take a step back and think about how social coordination occurs in other kinds of complex systems. For example, in multicellular organisms or in social insect colonies, there's incredible social coordination. Think about all the cells in your body. They're genetic clones. They specialize to do different tasks. There are millions of cells in your body that are designed to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the whole. That's what they've evolved to do that. And it can occur because all of the cells of our body have the same genetic instructions. So long as the working out of all that code leads to benefit for the group or for the organism, the genetic instructions will spread through the generations. In social insects, it works a similar way by making the insects siblings of each other. They're all half sisters and half-sisters. So there are chemical signals that induce hormonal changes that encourage coordinated behavior. Again, it doesn't necessarily benefit the individual ant, but it creates a colony that is highly successful. Those genes can spread because they're all siblings. Well, humans are not all relatives, so how does coordinated behavior spread in human societies to create the world that we know now? What I would suggest is that in humans, it's these emotional correlates of the source domains of our social metaphors that encourage this same result. In other words, these social metaphors connect to our emotional life and our notions of what is moral, what is good, and what is right, to encourage people to behave in ways that promote the group, even if, by doing so, they often disadvantage themselves individually. And I suggest that this is the fundamental process involved in the emergence of complexity in human societies. And I think it's the fundamental dimension of the process that's been going on for the last several thousand years. So where I'm at right now is just proposing this as a way of thinking about the problem and thinking about how to put together these various pieces into a coherent model. We're not at the point yet of figuring out how to do this mathematically or formally, but my hope is, it took several decades after Darwin to come up with population genetics, so it may take some time to figure out how to formalize this. But my hope is that we're getting closer to a view of how this stuff works, so that we can begin thinking about those problems. These are the folks that have supported me in this work, and I want to thank you for your attention. So I think that there is another class here, is that right, John?
Yeah, we have maybe 3 minutes for questions.
And I can hang out in the hall and things too. If there are any questions,
Any questions for Dr. Ortman?
Scott, quickly, thanks very much, appreciate it. The emphasis on social coordination and particularly the appearance of metaphors associated with it is a very powerful one, and we can certainly see that occurring. The other side of that coin is fear. Fear and domination are also paired in the context of those emergent forms that you're talking about. You know that quite well. So we cannot let slide those particular dimensions of the way in which these things come into existence, I would say.
That's a very fair point. It points out the importance of looking at the way different societies conceptualize fear and use fear in their metaphors. I think that's an important direction to go. Thanks.
Thank you.